Welcome to this episode of Trade Talks from the Global Business Dialogue. Each is a conversation on trade policy with someone who knows something about it. I'm Judge Morris with the Global Business Dialogue, and today with me is Dave Salmonsen of the American Farm Bureau Federation, the unified national voice of agriculture. Dave joined the Farm Bureau in 1996 and is their Senior Director for Congressional Relations. 25 years is a good long time, but Dave's roots in agriculture go deeper than that. He grew up on the dairy and vegetable farm in Manlius, New York, just southeast of Syracuse. Prior to joining the Farm Bureau, Dave served as the assistant to the commissioner of the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. Currently, in addition to his other responsibilities, Dave serves as the Farm Bureau's liaison to the President's Advisory Committee on Trade Policy and Negotiations. When I have a question about agriculture, Dave's my first call. In a sense, American agriculture has a symbiotic relationship with the world. U.S. farmers need foreign markets, and the world's consumers need American products. From wheat to pork, from apples to pecans, that's the overview. To make the system work, however, U.S. farmers must constantly adjust to the dynamics of often dramatic changes in the weather. That's certainly true these days, and in an ever-evolving geopolitical situation. We'll get to those things in a moment. But I wonder, Dave, if you could set the stage for us with some economic context, in short, with some numbers. For example, roughly, what is the overall value of U.S. agricultural production?
On the on-farm value, the value of when a farmer and rancher sells their products is right about $140 billion or so annually.
Okay. If you add in the food processors, the grocery stores, etc., how much of America's gross domestic product is accounted for by agriculture and food production?
Sure, with adding the broader agricultural sector together, it's about $1.1 trillion annually, or about a 5.2% share of the U.S. economy.
Okay. Shifting the focus to trade, how important is agriculture to U.S. trade? How important are food and agriculture to U.S. exports overall?
Well, in 2020, we had a little over 135 billion of exports, and USDA is forecasting perhaps 165 billion or more this year in total. Wow. U.S. ag exports. Now, remember what an ag and food exports are. Now we're talking about the product ranging from, tons and tons of corn and soybeans that look the same way as they did when they left the farm. A little bit of cleaning, but then loaded on the ship and go. So that's an easily identifiable product. Or you're talking about meat products, which don't exactly look like they did when the animal left the farm, and all the other things that go into processed foods. So, you're adding value. So you're including, we call bulk agricultural commodities and value-added products. The total U.S. ag exports in 2020 were about 2.1 trillion. So ag is a pretty good share of what we're selling around the world.
Okay, but in a sense, more to the point, how important are exports to U.S. agriculture?
Yeah, it's pretty consistent up and down, but really we're a little over 20% of U.S. ag production goes into the export market. Very important. And when you look at specific commodities, it really tells the tale. A product like walnuts, almost 80% is exported. Cotton is in the high 70s to 80%. Cotton's very interesting. You go up to like about the year 2000, cotton was primarily a domestic product. But then again, you had very quick shift in the late 90s, early 2000s. The mills went overseas. The U.S. cotton followed the mills. So U.S. cotton goes to mills in Central America when they work, especially China. We think of the growth of China in textiles, Southeast Asian countries. So China, cotton is now a U.S. Primarily an export product. Soybeans, half our soybeans, almost half of our wheat goes around the world, down to about 20+% of our corn. Pork is over 20-some%. Dairy, 15% and more, which is very interesting because you think back 25+ years ago. Remember, once upon a time, I remember there was an import quotas on dairy. We didn't import any dairy. But then we got rid of those, the WTO, the Uruguay Round Agreements, converted those into TRQs, and then basically got rid of the quotas on dairy imports. The dairy industry, starting from almost nothing, decided to grow exports. And they've been very successful in doing that, and it keeps going up all the time. So a lot of products, either overall, you might say dependent overall on exports, but exports certainly add to diversity of marketing and add to helping keep up prices here at home for U.S. farmers and ranchers.
That's very helpful. If I could go to something that I try to ask everybody, and that's about COVID-19, which has been such a big part of all of our worlds for the last almost 2 years now. We're getting into it. I realize it's a big question, but could you say a word or two about the impact of COVID on American agriculture and perhaps even about your own work in Washington?
Sure. Well, we'll start off with the immediate impacts when that happened last year in just a small place. We've seen on the news what happened in Florida. All those fruit and vegetable production, all the greens for salads, everything that went on board all those cruise ships that leave Fort Lauderdale and Miami, in one day, that market was gone. And you saw farmers basically, destroying crops because there was no outlet for it. I mean, that part of the food service was huge. And they've recovered some, but it took a while for that supply chain and to get those products into other markets. And when you've got a crop that's ready to pick, that's supposed to go on these ships, you can't move it very easily to another place to go. We've seen, and it's a lingering impact now, but we saw impacts of COVID, of course, on the meatpacking industry. They didn't have the people. They didn't have the workers to process meat products. Well, that backed up to farmers, and you saw this thing of pork producers. An animal is fed out, goes to a certain point of view, it has to be harvested. It has to go to the processing facility. So there was nothing to do with these animals. Some got overly large, the price was down, it wasn't as good. Piglets, there was no place to feed them out because the farms were full. So they had to euthanize some piglets. So that was an immediate issue there. But those issues are still continuing. We've got a real problem in cattle marketing here in the US. We still have limited processing capacity. It's not what it was before the pandemic. So prices of cattle are down. Farmers make a multi-year investment and a plan in producing cattle, beef. Well, when those animals are ready to go to market, they're ready to go to market. But if the processor doesn't need them, supply and demand, the price is down. And right now in the cattle area, it's really disturbing for ranchers because they see higher prices of meat in the markets, in the supermarkets. They know the processors are charging more because there's less supply, but they have a lot of animals and they're getting paid less for them. So this COVID is not just an immediate impact, it's leading to a long-term impact in that market area. And impacts in Washington, D.C., well, just a few weeks ago, there was a Senate Agriculture hearing about the whole cattle market system. And there's calls for legislation on transparency, how to do more in cattle marketing to get more value back to the producer. There's a lot of push, and there's money being proposed through USDA to establish more meat processing facilities in more parts of the country, diversify that, make them try to get seed money in there to build more facilities for more meat processing so we don't have this current situation replicated. So yeah, it certainly has again, we had immediate impacts and now we're having some long-term impacts and we're now seeing the government involvement and response.
Yeah, no, actually, you mentioned in that really interesting COVID commentary that a little bit about supply and demand. I'd like to turn to those famous lines. But let's start with the demand side, especially the ability of U.S. producers to reach customers in foreign markets. That's complicated, of course, by the fact that in almost every country, agriculture is special. There's special provisions for it, some of which effectively keep out exports, including exports from the United States. And that sort of makes trade agreements more important than they might otherwise be. How much of our exports or U.S. exports go to countries in which the United States has a trade agreement, and how much to others, do you think?
Well, again, let's take an overall view. if we consider the fact we're almost all of the world's a member of the World Trade Organization, well, through that basis, we have trade agreements with everybody. And that's the basic rules. But if you're talking about regular free trade agreements, well, I have to answer that in two ways. If we're doing formal trade promotion authority type free trade agreements, we have those with many countries, and that is about 75 to 80 billion of our ag exports go to those countries. You're thinking Canada, Mexico, Australia, Peru, Colombia, take your pick. There's a lot of them. It made a big difference. We've had a lot of growth over the years because we've had FTAs. If you're thinking of trade agreements a little more broadly, the phase one agreement with China, the phase one agreement with Japan, if you include that trade, well, you add another 30, 40 billion onto that, over 105 to 110 billion dollars of our trade is going to countries where we have a preferential trade agreement. So, they're important, they work, and that's when we can try and get them. We always encouraging any administration that comes along to engage and work on trade agreements, and that's also why we work so hard to get them passed through Congress. Reducing tariffs matters. Reducing non-tariff barriers, getting science-based standards on food matters for U.S. trade.
I really may go over some of this ground a couple times, but that's okay. Arguably, America's most important FTA, and you can correct me on this if you think differently, is the USMCA. It's worth pointing out, however, that the Trump administration, which negotiated it, didn't call it a free trade agreement. They just called it the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. How important is USMCA to US ag? Did it improve on NAFTA? And if so, how?
Well, it was critically important for two big reasons. One was it continued our tariff-free trade with Mexico. That was an issue. We were getting rid of, we're going to move on from NAFTA. Remember some of the talk early on? We might pull out of NAFTA. Of course, we worked hard to make sure that didn't happen. Everybody did. I think that was probably over 25 years in DC, the 24 hours of most, and I'll use the nice word, excitement I've ever had in DC was that one day when we thought something like that might happen. That was a long one. Anyways, so USMCA, we grew from a few $1 billion in 1993 before NAFTA of our trade with Canada and Mexico. It wasn't a big deal. And now we're over 40 billion and we can keep growing. So keeping that totally tariff-free trade with Mexico, mostly tariff-free trade with Canada was the signal achievement, and to keep that going for the future. Otherwise, we'd also make sure hopefully we get improvements in where we have some barriers. We negotiated improvements on dairy exports to Canada. We negotiated improvements through expanded TRQs also for poultry. So we're able to sit down and get some benefit there. We got rid of one of the vestiges of the old Canadian Wheat Board. They still had, that's been gone for years, but still Canada was imposing something, and I have to call the Canadian air effect. That's what I called it to myself. As soon as U.S. wheat crossed the border, breathed that lovely Canadian air, all of a sudden it was lower in value. No matter what the quality of the U.S. wheat was, it became feed-grade wheat in Canada. Well, we got rid of that. So, we made some improvements there. But I think we also made improvements in just the relationship and a lot of emphasis through biotechnology and other things. We need science-based approaches when we're dealing with issues. Then we still have some trade issues, and we all need to work hard to live up to those. So still work to do, but we're encouraged about this relationship going forward.
I think you've sort of answered the questions I had on USMCA, but we can come back to it if you want. On China, in January 2020, the U.S. and China signed what has become known as the Phase 1 agreement. You already referred to it briefly. For many, its most notable feature is that it included commitments by China to buy various U.S. things, including U.S. ag products. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of whether China's lived up to those commitments. Yeah, that's the first question.
Well, they're getting there. And I'll say that for 2020, remember this agreement was announced in January 15th. I think it went into effect February 14th of 2020. And, you know, coming right off the tariffs that were imposed and all of that, and starting in 2018 and 2019, we hadn't been selling a lot to China. You know, before, say, up to 2016 or 17, we were in the low 20s. We got down to about 9 or 10 billion a year because of the impact of tariffs and all that. So our sales to China had gone down. But in the agreement, over 2 years, so for 20 and for 21 together, it was supposed to be up to 80 billion. Very, you know, a goal that people were like, wow, that's where'd that number come from? That was quite the goal. And if you just did it out, and it wasn't completely half and half, but the overall goal on the China side was about 36 billion for 2020, and for this year it's 44 billion. Now, the U.S. export side and the China purchases side are a little different. China purchases side, because you add in costs of transportation, costs of insurance, costs of all that. So we figured last year for U.S. ag exports to reach the 36 billion on China, we needed to sell about 33 billion of ag products here from the U.S. side without the added costs. Okay, so we got to about 27.3 billion. Huge turnabout. Just about this time last year, China started buying corn and soybeans, as we expected they would. You know, they were mostly a seasonal buyer. They were buying our bulk commodities in the fall at harvest time, right? You know, they buy from Brazil the first half of the year when they're having their harvest. The first few months, they buy from us in the fall at our harvest. That's the way China trade has gone, at least for those products. So they got there. They ended up about, you know, 18% or so below their commitment. But again, we were, this time last year, we'd only sold about, you know, $7 billion to them. By the end of the year, we sold almost $20 billion more over 5 months. So it was a big increase. Starting off this year, we're pretty close. Up to now through May, latest figures we have, we've sold about 12.5 billion, and the pace China would need to, you know, is supposed to be selling them about 14.5 billion. So they've started off strong. They've been continued buying a lot of corn for various reasons. Soybeans tracked off some, but still buying. And a part of the agreement was also a better improvement, a lot of standards. They still had a lot of barriers, old BSE standards on beef that were holding us up some, pork, poultry, dairy, all kinds of things, which were included in the agreement. Now, these improvements will continue. There's no 2 years on that. That's part of the agreement. Those changes will go. So while they're buying a lot of bulk commodities, that's building up the number. They're also buying other things. They're increasing their purchases of other things. Now, it's a little tenuous, you might say. I'll use that word in the sense that the tariffs are still there, right? Now, both sides, the U.S. and China, have waived a lot of them. China importers could petition the government to waive tariffs on ag, and they did, and they granted those waivers. The U.S. side has their waiver process for products, all kinds of Chinese products, even though we still impose a lot of tariffs. But going forward, when the purchases commitment runs out at the end of 2021, the question is, you know, what will selling to China be in the future with tariffs and not a purchases commitment? So I think we've got issues that the Biden administration needs to deal with for agriculture in China.
You know, I mean, you sort of answered another question was in my mind, but just to stretch it a little bit further, do you see any likelihood of a follow-on to the phase one?
Well, speaking with the American Farm Bureau, and I think a lot of U.S. agriculture would like to see a follow-on. It has worked. You could make the argument they would have bought it anyways. Well, maybe they would have. I don't know. But they did with the commitment. But as I said earlier, we're entering a different world here. So whether the administration, I mean, they know, people know where we stand on this. They know we have an interest in that. We want to keep selling to China. You know, if you're talking to a grain grower in the Midwest, they know their price of soybeans and the price of corn basically doubled because of China buying last year. I mean, you're from $8 soybeans up to $15 bushel soybeans. Same with corn. You were $3 corn to $5.50 corn or $6 corn. It made such a difference. And coupled with the fact Brazil's had some weather issues, especially in their corn crop. you know, there's always other factors, but that was the China buying was an immediate hit to the market on the positive side for those growing and selling those products. Continuation in the future, you know, we're not sure. But of course, farmers expect this to keep going. They do, and they planted even more this year than last year. So they're kind of banking on the fact that these good markets will continue.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. If I could turn to a slightly separate issue and one which is kind of new in a way.
Yeah.
But while we're on the subject of China, some members of Congress, I believe, have expressed a little concern about Chinese purchases of American farmland. Is that an issue that concerns your members?
We've had that discussion before. It comes up. It's interesting that it's coming up now. I think this is a part of a few things. There is some discussion, you know, some states, and this is not a national or a federal thing, it's an individual state thing, have some limits on foreign ownership of farmland in their states. It has to be reported, and you know how it is all implemented, I'm not exactly sure, but it's been an issue in the past. I don't think it was China, it was other, you know, countries. You look at a country that owns a lot of, quote, land in the US, Canada, but it's timber. You know, in Maine or in the Pacific Northwest, you got a Canadian company that bought timberland, right? So they're probably, I don't know if they are the biggest, they probably are the biggest owner of farmland, if you call it that, in the US, foreign owner, of course, and that's not a lot compared to all the farmland in the US, but it's a lot of timberland. So that's a historic thing. That goes back a long way. So the fact with China, through other companies, you know, you've got investment in agricultural land by hedge funds. You know, we know with this COVID, one of the impacts last year, there's a lot of money seeking a place to be, and some of it's going in farmland in different parts of the country. Helps bid up prices in certain areas. You get the impact, people concerned that, well, land is getting so expensive. A younger farmer really has a hard time getting in the business. Any farmer expanding when they need to grow their business, it just becomes more expensive. So that is a concern that people are looking at, but it's interesting how it's been coming up lately in regards to China. So yeah. It's something that's can be kept track of, where you can find out who exactly the company that buys it, you know, who they really are.
If I could turn to another agreement, we've talked about agreements to which the United States is a party, but there is understandably a lot of attention being paid to one particular agreement to which the United States is not a party. That's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. As you know, that came into being after the Trump administration withdrew from TPP, which had been negotiated by the Obama administration. Do American farmers want the United States to join CPTPP?
Well, American Farm Bureau does. Our members, we have one of those policies that really doesn't have a lot of opportunity for nuance. It just says we support the U.S. joining the CPTPP. So okay. We thought agriculture, when it was the TPP, negotiated good provisions. We wanted to see standards throughout the Asia-Pacific region, which would help agricultural and all other trade. And it was a chance to do a free trade agreement with Japan, which we hadn't had before. And we got some provisions in there that we liked, especially lower tariffs on beef, pork, and other products that were going to be beneficial. So now we think it's still worth pursuing, and we support it.
Is there, I mean, you mentioned Japan. Is there anybody else? I mean, how big, for example, is the Vietnam loom among
right. Yeah, that would be, you know, after Japan, and there's more work to do with Japan. Either we pursue that with more discussions based on the phase 1 agreement we have with Japan, which they said we would do more, but we haven't seen more negotiations between the US and Japan on that. There were a lot of standards issues. There were some other issues with commodities, some dairy related issues, rice imports, other things that weren't addressed in the current US-Japan agreement. Maybe if we do it again through CPTPP, we can address those with Japan also. But again, Vietnam, or our pork industry, would like to have a deal with them. View that as a really excellent growth market. Other countries there, you know, Malaysia, there's countries in there we just, we can grow. We can grow our opportunities with them. I mean, half or more of the CPTPP countries, we already have trade agreements with Canada, Mexico, Peru, Colombia,
Right.
Australia. We don't have a deal with New Zealand, some of the others there. So this was a good way, and to have that region governed by a single set of rules, such a good growing region. And of course, it sets up, you know, the future for other countries being a part of it. So a lot of opportunity there if we can make it happen.
You mentioned other countries being part of it. As you know, that many have expressed some interest, I think of Korea and so forth, but the UK has actually formally applied for membership. Would a CPTPP with the UK be more or less attractive to your members? Yeah, assuming they're going to get in, which I kind of think they will.
Yeah, fascinating approach, isn't it? If we're it's the other way, if we're, you know, if for whatever reasons we don't seem to be able to go forward directly with a direct US-UK agreement, do we do it through CPTPP? Well, that might work, you know, in some parts on the ag side, if it worked that way and we're a part of it. You know, I don't know if, I can't remember if CPTPP really encompasses all the issue areas that a formal US-UK agreement would. I'm thinking, of course, finance, other business areas.
Right.
I don't know. There would be a lot more in there, but it would be at least one way to deal with them if that all happened, or it would just be an addition if we do go back, which we're in favor of, negotiating directly and making a deal with the UK. Of course, with the UK, you know, that we want them to move on from their regulatory climate they were under when they were part of the European Union for what, for all those years, 40 plus years, as far as dealing with our exports to them of beef and pork and poultry and other products, standards that they have. So a lot of work to do there. And maybe we could do it through CPTPP, though. It is a, you know, more opportunities are better than none, I suppose.
Finally, on the negotiating side, look, at the very beginning of this conversation, we talked about agreements through the WTO and therefore covering almost everybody. My understanding, but I don't know this as well as I should, is that there are still negotiations going on in the WTO on agriculture. Where do those stand, and do you expect anything to come out of the ministerial November, December of this year?
Yes, there are discussions in the Committee on Agriculture. I think we'll see something from them soon. Not new. I mean, of course, we can go back to everything we started with Doha talks and before. So the issues come back, right? They haven't been solved. Some of the issues come back. So we still have from the U.S. ag side, we want to see more market access. We want to see those rates come down around the world. We want to see a lowering of tariffs on the WTO side. Okay, well, other countries think that they want to see, you know, action on domestic subsidies. They want countries to say, well, in order to do anything in market access, other countries have to remove their, you know, lower their levels on trade distorting domestic support. Well, those discussions have traditionally gone together, but you can't do one without the other, at least get U.S. agriculture interested. We're interested in the market access. We know there's discussions on domestic support will also be there. They have to both be dealt with if you're ever gonna get to anything. In the near term, I think coming in the ministerial, you could deal with issues on the notifications. We don't have enough transparency in the WTO. We don't have enough countries keeping up to date on the notifications of their subsidies. So if you ever need to go ahead with an action, you know what you're doing. That's basic, and that was a basic part of the agreement in the first place. Of course, we also need some reform of the appellate body. So we have a functioning dispute settlement system. You know, countries, they need to engage on that. There's a lot of ideas on that. And we've always had this issue of special and differential treatment, and the fact that some countries can self-designate whether they're developing or not, and then take advantage of having to do less on tariff reduction and other things. We know other countries are developing, and that's their right to self-designate that, and they should be. we've got some other countries who think of move beyond the developing stage and should be shouldering the same commitments as others, as the U.S. does, of course. So there's always a lot to work on. There's, the public stock holding issues we've had with India. They're still there for discussion. I don't know how much can be achieved at this ministerial, but these issues all need to be engaged.
Okay, well, we'll leave the demand side, is what I call it here, for a minute here. Move on to the supply side. On the supply side, the drought of these last several months has been felt certainly throughout the West, from the Pacific Northwest to the Mexican border. And now, of course, here in Oregon, we've got fires to deal with too. I wondered, how have these developments, rather difficult developments, affected crop yields?
Well, let me start with two ways of answering that. We did a recent survey of our 13 Western states, of our members out there, our organizations out there. And, we wanted to find out, how are the current drought conditions affecting life on the farm? What are you doing to respond to drought? We had about over 85% of those responding. I'm not saying everybody responded, this was a survey, but people were saying if they're in animal agriculture, and if they're like grazers using the rangeland, they're selling off parts of their herd. They just don't have enough grass to feed them. Either now or with the drought, they won't be able to make hay to feed them through the winter, supplement their feed now or get them through the winter. So classically, they're reducing their herd size. They're selling animals. With like California and specialty crops, and probably everybody's seen the news, orchards are being ripped out. By the older orchards, they don't have enough water to keep the trees alive. So some older trees are just being taken out of production, or an operation that may have multiple crops. If almonds is the most important thing, you're probably saving your water for that and letting some field crops go. Either you didn't plant them or you're just going to let them go. You don't have the amount of water. So, and going forward, when you think of something that's a multi-year crop like an orchard, dryness puts stress on that system. So going forward, I'm sure we'll see some impacts on future production because of the lack of water this year. Now, overall, for U.S. agriculture, you think of the crops, and I think, you go to things called the planting estimates. USDA just came out with those just recently. And we'll see at the end of the day. I think, we're seeing the drought in the western states. We're also seeing it in the upper Midwest, the plain states, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa. Parts of Iowa are very dry. Parts of Nebraska. You usually don't think of drought as much going in there, but it's been coming east somewhat. So, but as far as plantings, again, we'll see the impact on the crop. Our corn and soybean acreages were up. Farmers planted a little more, a few percentage more. We got over almost 93 million acres of corn in the ground, almost 88 million acres of soybeans, about 47 million acres of wheat. Those are up a few percentage points from last year. I think farmers are feeling good about the prices and opportunities for those crops. They put more of that in the ground. We'll know, this fall what impacts dry weather had on the final yields, and whether we'll be able to have adequate products for domestic and foreign uses. So that's always what you start thinking about when you go look to the future in a dry year.
How will the drought affect export prices and grocery store prices?
Yes, well, if you're getting to a point where you're having any constriction, where you're worried about it, having enough supply to meet all commitments, that certainly should put upward pressure on prices, right, over time. Bulk commodity prices translating to grocery store prices, as we know, there's not a lot of wheat value to the farmer in a loaf of bread. Somebody say there's maybe a few pennies. So if you had wheat, same with corn, same with soybeans, bulk commodities, they can go up in price. Sure, that's an additional cost to the processor, whatever they're making. They're going to pass that price on. So you may see some, but at this point, I can't really quantify what that's going to mean because, again, for things that we're looking to harvest in the fall, we don't know yet. We don't know yet. We've had more immediate prices, as I was talking earlier about meat, and that was more related to the impacts of COVID on the meatpacking industry from last year and continuing into this year. But of course, higher prices for grain means higher prices for feed for animals. You know, works through the system. You know, that could have an impact there for final product prices to processors and in the supermarket. So drought, you know, we all know, right? It's cumulative. A flood happens and we see it in a day or two. A drought takes months and months to build, and all of a sudden you've got problems. So again, this is a developing situation.
I didn't ask whether it would whether the drought would affect the ability to meet the commitments to China. That in other words, China made the commitments to buy.
Yeah.
Are we going to be in a position to sell?
I think we will. I think we will. Yes, in certain areas there may be less, but other parts of the country, you know, in the Midwest, the big production areas, they're getting right now, fingers crossed, they're getting adequate moisture, they're adding adequate rains. And so the outlook for the crops overall, again, I think this will be regional, but we should have the product there to sell.
Okay, well that's good news in the bad, if you will. I mean, but yeah, if I could switch topics a little bit and talk to some about tensions with sort of other interests in the U.S. To a significant degree, I'm talking about environment now. America's farmers are the great stewards of the land. That said, there are areas of tension between the agricultural community and some other interests. For example, in the name of aiding the salmon population, some have called for a removal of the dams on the Snake River in Washington and Idaho, runs through Idaho particularly. But I believe the president of your organization, the Farm Bureau, has said, no, that's a bad idea. What is the situation there?
Yeah. Well, when you think about dam construction throughout the West, think of all the reasons they've been put in, especially in the West. Well, you had it for getting water for irrigation, so you could have agriculture. So in that area, so you'd have that. You had, and sometimes there is floods, so dams work on flood control. Of course, they also work on hydropower generation. So there's a lot of reasons dams are built, right? Aids to navigation in some places. You know, the Snake River dams were put in the 60s and 70s, I think, when those projects were finally completed and brought a lot of benefits to that region, as I've just said. And now we have the issues of, well, you know, can we get the salmon up the streams? Can they do it with the ladders that they construct, other ways of getting around the dam so the salmon can spawn? But it seems to me, and I think our president expressed, listening to the members we have in those regions, that this has to be a process if there's going to be something else done and different ways of addressing the salmon issue than just calling for the wholesale removal of dams and taking away those benefits that have been there now for 50 plus years for agriculture. So there needs to be a process.
Yeah, yeah, you sold me on that one, but that's I'm not the decider. There's another sort of big issue which we've not really gotten into, but I get the feeling it's pretty big, and I'm wondering if you just sort of talk about it. And that's the one that goes by the label of the waters of the United States, where we had a set of policies under Obama, changing policies under Trump, change again now. What is the regulatory situation? What's this all about?
Okay, without going into all there will be another topic for more hours talking about all the turns of water law, the Clean Water Act. But the current situation is under the Trump administration, the Obama administration put out something called the Waters of the U.S. rule, which would have expanded the jurisdiction of the Federal Clean Water Act into regions and areas that never had been before. Ephemeral streams, things like, you know, streams only run a little bit of the year, but then they would be jurisdictional and that would have impact on land use. Well, that's agriculture and other people, but a lot of farmers affected. So the navigable water rule under the Trump administration got rid of that WOTUS rule, replaced it, and brought the waters under federal jurisdiction closer to what the title is. Navigable waters, which is what's in the Constitution. You know, it was started about what you can float on, what you can use for navigation, what you can use commercially. Closer to that, not only that, but closer to that, you know, waters are also have state and local laws that apply to them, of course, or tribal laws that apply. And it's not all the federal. So that made it, I think, more clear for farmers and ranchers what they could do with their land and what waters were controlled by the federal statutes. So the Obama administration is now proposing to go back, look at that rule again. I think we just had a federal district court ruling just last week, which affirmed, and I think the Obama administration, the Biden administration is with this, that the current rule stays in effect. The navigable waters rule stays in effect until it is replaced, if it is, by a new rule. So EPA says they're going to go out, do listening sessions. They'll have to start a rulemaking process. So we're looking at, you know, rulemaking. Usually you talk in terms of years, 18 months, 2 years or more before a new rule can get into place. I mean, legally, I mean, you've got to get rid of the old rule while you also propose a new rule. So that takes time. So there will be a lot of discussion involving agricultural community, environmental community, all the jurisdictions, all the municipalities, construction, all kinds of other home builders, everybody else who has an interest in land use in this country that's affected by these water rules.
I don't mean to surprise you at all, but is this an issue where the Farm Bureau will be involved? Will we be taking positions on this?
Yeah, we've been heavily involved in all of these, and we will continue to be involved in this to make sure that we get our viewpoints from our farmer and rancher members heard through this whole process.
We've covered a lot of ground, Dave, but I have not yet asked you for a bottom line. We're halfway through a difficult summer and halfway through a tumultuous year. And I wonder if you could maybe comment on what your top 2 or 3 legislative priorities are for the American Farm Bureau Federation for this year.
Well, we talked a lot about trade, so I'll leave that to one side. We've already covered that. Taxes. You know, I always say when the president came out, the administration came out and said, well, we want to do things about dealing with what we call stepped up basis taxes and inheritance taxes, the estate tax.
Oh.
You know, want to raise those. And, you know, capital gains, stepped up basis is about, you know, you have land, it may increase over time, the value. And then when you either inherit it or purchase it or whatever from a family member, you take on the value of that improvement, of that increase, but you don't have to pay taxes on it. That's been US law since the 20s, called stepped up basis. Well, one of the proposals is that we'll add that in, and that increase in land value will be taxed. Well, there's some talk about, well, maybe some kind of an exemption for farms or whatever, but that's become a real big issue. Taxes always are a big issue for U.S. farmers and ranchers. One of their biggest costs, right? When you own a lot of land, you pay a lot of taxes. And something like this would be such a big change and would really increase the tax burden on those families trying to move on their farms to the next generation. So big issue there. Of course, labor. We're having COVID added its disruptions, other things, but shortage of labor across the country. Farmers just can't get enough people to work on farms, either full-time or seasonal workers. So we're having a lot of trouble with that. And there's legislation to deal with that. So that's definitely an issue here in town, in Washington, D.C. And of course, as we were just talking about, the whole issue of drought and drought assistance programs. And continuing, you talk about the continuing issues, the budget. You know, we're always keenly interested in the appropriations for the USDA and for some other agencies. We have an interest in see the budget process that's going on now. Infrastructure, these big infrastructure bills. We're always saying we need better roads. Inland waterway system always needs improvements. The ports, we haven't even talked about ports and port congestion. They need improvements. So we're always in favor of having, you know, resources and more resources spent in helping farmers move their crops to market and just running their businesses. It affects farms, it affects everybody. So there's always a lot of big issues, but this year we've got a lot of keen interest in several of the issues that are certainly part of the administration's plan this year.
Dave, this is discussion so far, at least from my perspective, been very rich, and I can't thank you enough for it. And you should certainly have the last word as we get to the end here. With no apologies for the pun at all, American agriculture is an enormous field. There are lots of things we haven't covered or covered enough. Still, is there a final thought you'd like to share before we turn off the computers and say goodbye?
Yeah, I just want to make the point. I think it covers so much of what we're talking about. You know, we haven't really got into the world of everything. And again, it is related. Sustainability, what impacts the climate. There's a lot of things being talked about now. But I think whether it's on there or other parts of agriculture, other parts of public policy, farming, like other businesses, is always dealing and having to adapt to change. Whether it's business change, whether it's changes in the way we use our land, whether it's changes in technology. You know, I went to, when I was a lad growing up, there still are these farm equipment shows. And the feature of the farm equipment show in upstate New York was always the annual plowing contest. You know, the equipment manufacturers got their biggest tractors, the plows with the most bottoms, the biggest plows, and raced across the fields to show the farmers, with this equipment, you could do more, better, faster. Well, that was, again, 40 years ago. You go to an equipment show now, that I went to one a few years ago, again, that same show, there was hardly a plow to be seen on the ground because everybody had gone to minimum tillage, using chemicals to kill the weeds, far less travel over the land, far less usage of energy, gasoline for tractors, and made it much quicker to plant crops. So technology changes, farmers adapt to that change, and that minimum tillage we have now is seen as a great thing to help sequester carbon. Now, they did it for economic reasons, but it also has this good climate effect and is being looked at as one of the solutions as we go to sequester carbon. So I think, and whether we're using it for biotech products, GMO chemicals that we use, or GMO seeds, the use of proper chemicals to make those seeds thrive, you know, it all works together as a system, but it's technological changes that increase production and we think have a positive impact on the environment. So, you know, I think we all need to show that we need to change and adapt. We need to use technology where it's prudent, where it's useful, and not put up barriers to it. And that, of course, gets us back to how we trade the products that are produced using all this technology around the world. I think that certainly is something we want to keep doing, and a challenge we also face today.
Dave, that was just an enormously helpful set of thoughts in this time we've been talking, and I can't thank you enough for making the effort, because you put in the real effort here, and then it's much appreciated. I hope at some point you'll come back and give us an update. I also want to thank those of you who are with us online. Watch your inbox for the next episode of Trade Talks. In the meantime, have a cup of something with someone. Enjoy the conversation.